In this video, I'm going to focus on civil rights in the 20th century. But before we get there, I want to do just a super quick overview of different phases of kind of civil rights movements in American history, talk about some amendments, things like that. Okay, so the first, there's always been, pushback against slavery, against racism. But the first big, really popular push that we see in American history is the abolitionist movement, okay? And that leads up until the Civil War. The Civil War runs from 1861 to 1865. In 1868, the 14th Amendment is passed, which gave people of color equal protection under the law. In 1870, the 15th Amendment gave black men the right to vote. Okay, while technically people of color were getting more rights with these two amendments, states went on to establish a number of restrictive laws designed to keep African Americans from engaging in political process, from voting, and this is called the Jim Crow laws. Okay, things like literacy tests, segregation are established and codified. Okay, segregation was upheld in the 1896 Supreme Court decision, Plessy versus Ferguson. This is the case until Brown versus Board of Education in 1954. Okay, so often what historians classify as kind of the start of the civil rights movement is in the 1950s. Okay, of course, this is an oversimplification. People don't just start caring about racial equality in the 1950s. We've seen many figures through the course of this class, Sojourner Truth, Frederick Douglass, Ida B. Wells, all these figures that were working towards this. All right, so there is consistent work, but there is absolutely this big push in the 1950s, 1960s towards racial equality. Okay, so there's a lot of big names in the civil rights movement. I'm going to focus on two, Martin Luther King Jr. and Fannie Lou Hamer in this video. Both are committed Christians, which is part of the reason I'm talking about these two. King was a pastor. Hamer was a lay believer, but she really infuses faith, the Bible, in her speeches, okay, and in her life, all right? So I know all of you know plenty about King, but I really want to focus on his role as a pastor, as a religious leader here. I found a great little video on him in Dexter Avenue Church. PBS put it out. It's like 6-7 minutes, something like that, on Moodle. As many of you are preparing for the ministry, I thought you would kind of enjoy looking at this side of him. Okay. So I'm going to spend a little time on King, but I also want to preface this. Likely you do know plenty about him. I'm very aware of how public schools teach about King. Often they teach a kind of a simplified version of him and civil rights. Trevor Noah in his book Born a Crime describes it like this, and I'm kind of paraphrasing here, but he says Americans teach that there was slavery and racism and that it was bad, and then there was Martin Luther King and now it's over. I think this is a legitimate criticism he has of kind of our education system and how we teach on civil rights. Okay, so King was a really influential figure, but he is following in this tradition of decades of grassroots effort. There are many important other leaders, and as I said, I'm going to talk about Hamer after him. So just real brief biography. He was born in Atlanta in 1929. He's the son and the grandson of Baptist pastors. He entered the ministry as well, and he preached regularly for the rest of his life. Okay. He got his doctorate at Boston University in 1955. Howard Thurman was on staff or faculty at BU, who was another important voice in the civil rights era, and they knew each other. King had an opportunity to take a pastorate in the North, but he decided to take this call at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama in 1954. And it was in 1955 that the Montgomery Bus Boycott was this turning point in King's life. Okay, he was an executive member of the NAACP, and so he became this leader in the boycott. So actually, I'm going to take a minute because we've all heard the story of the boycott in school. Rosa Parks is on the bus. She's a seamstress. She's tired and she didn't want to move after a long day's work and thus studying the civil rights movement. Okay. This is such an oversimplification and not actually like all that true either. Yes, her arrest launched the Montgomery bus strike, and that was a very important moment in the civil rights movement, without question. But the story really appears to leave things to chance, all right? Park was actually the secretary of a local chapter of the NAACP. She was active in civil rights work for at least a decade prior to her action on the bus. The murder of Emmett Till had occurred shortly before this. If you don't know this piece of history, Till was a 14-year-old boy who was brutally murdered, and the all-white jury acquitted the two men who killed him despite eyewitnesses. Okay, and this prompted a national outcry. Okay, Parks had actually been at a church service at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, King's Church, about Till a few days prior. All right, so all these events are kind of connected, and things had reached a breaking point. Later, when talking about the events, Parks said she wasn't physically tired. She was tired of the way things were. She had previous run-ons with this particular driver as well. So she wasn't the first person to refuse to give up a seat to a white person, but this time it really took off. The boycott lasted for 382 days, and it ended when the Supreme Court ruled that segregation was unconstitutional. All right. So through King's life, he was the target of much violence. His home was firebombed, and in 1958, he was stabbed actually while signing books in New York City. In 1957, he founded the Southern Christian Leadership Conference with a number of other civil rights leaders, including like Rustin. And King became the first president. And within this role, he traveled extensively, giving talks and leading nonviolent protests. In 1960, he moved to Atlanta and co-pastored Ebenezer Baptist Church with his father. And he was part of this big march on Washington in 1963. This is where he gave the I Have a Dream speech, which I should put up in case somebody hasn't seen it. After the speech, he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1964. He was the youngest person ever to receive it. He was 35. And then in 1968, he went to Memphis, Tennessee in support of the Black Sanitary Public Works employees, and he was assassinated on April 4th. He was 39 years old. The assassination led to riots all around the country. 68 was a rough year all around. All right, so I want to compare him to Fannie Lou Hamer. They were very different types of leaders. But both very important. Hamer was born Fannie Lou Townsend in 1917 in Mississippi. She was the daughter of sharecroppers. She was, one of 20 kids. Her father, interestingly, was also a Baptist pastor. In addition to being a farmer. She had to leave school at the age of 12. So whereas King actually got his doctorate, she, had a 8th grade education. I think 7th, 8th grade. That's about what that shakes out to be. She married a man named Perry Hamer in 1944, and she was working as a timekeeper at a plantation. All right. And so she wasn't actually politically active until 1962 when some civil rights leaders came to town, and Hamer was inspired to go register to vote. And she had to take a literacy test, which is part of the Jim Crow laws. And it wasn't actually a literacy test. It was basically like giving them your address so folks could come and harass you is kind of how this shook out, or threaten you. As a result, she was fired from her job. The home where she was staying was shot 16 times. Her husband convinced her to take their daughters and leave, stay with their niece. And she ends up, speaking at some colleges about this experience, about trying to vote. She failed the first literacy test, but passed her second. And her family faced night riders, police invading her home. Her husband was arrested on false charges. They got death threats in the mail. And eventually she was arrested on completely fake charges, and she was beaten in jail. She suffered permanent damage to her kidney, to her eye, and after a period of recovery in New York City, she goes back to public speaking and encouraging people in Mississippi to register to vote. She's a really, really good preacher, speaker. It's kind of all enmeshed in one. She uses tons of biblical language in her speech. So in the mid 1960s, she gets really involved in politics. And this is kind of an interesting moment. In Mississippi, the Democratic Party only allowed white members. Okay, so African Americans in the state created an alternative Democratic Party called the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, which elected delegates for the 1964 Democratic National Convention. And here's the interesting part. Because of all the success of like canvassing African Americans in Mississippi, there was now over 80,000 Black people who could vote, and so they were legally part of the Mississippi Freedom Party, and they elected a delegation of 68 people. 64 were Black, 4 were white in this delegation to challenge the seating of this all-white party of the Mississippi Democratic the Mississippi Democratic Party at the Democratic National Convention in Atlantic City. The challenge failed, but it got a lot of coverage, okay? Lyndon Johnson was furious about the whole event. And after Hamer gave a speech on television, and the DNC, after seeing this, negotiates with the group that they could get 2 non-voting delegation seats, right? They sent 68, and they're offering them 2 non-voting seats. Minnesota's own Hubert Humphrey actually outlined this alleged compromise, explaining his position on the ticket was at risk and they couldn't do anything about this. And Hamer has this brilliant response. And this is a quote from her. She says, "Senator Humphrey, I've been praying about you and I've been thinking about you, and you're a good man. You know what's right. The trouble is you're afraid to do what you know is right. You want this job. I lost my job. Do you mean to tell me that your position is more important than 400,000 Black people's lives?" Okay, so the delegation rejects this offer, which, interesting, Martin Luther King told them to take it, that it was a symbolic victory, and they're like, no, they weren't going to compromise. And then, oddly enough, another of these like kind of quirky things in history, the leaders of the delegates were actually sent on vacation to West Africa by Harry Belafonte, which was actually a really moving experience for Hamer. She was completely burnt out and disillusioned at this point, and so this kind of helped, revitalize her in a sense. So she kind of leaves the political arena after this, and in 1969 she starts a program called the Freedom Farm Cooperative, and it starts as a small program called the Pink Pig, but it grew incredibly, and by 71 they had over 33 plots of land, thousands of acres, and they constructed 70 affordable houses. And she continued to travel the country speaking out against discrimination, promoting the Freedom Farm Collective, and speaking out against the Vietnam War. She died in 1977.